Micro interactions part 2. In today's video, we are going to develop 4 new components for our template. The first one is going to be a component that we can use to reorder elements, for example, in a list or in a grid. The second one is going to be a very cool button with an animation for our icon. Very simple, but it's going to add so much to your landing pages. The third one is going to be a component that we can use to wrap any element, and it's going to make those elements sticky, meaning that they are going to follow the mouse with a very cool spring-like behavior. And the final one is going to be a morphing gradient. So basically an element that is going to morph the border radius, the scale, and the rotation, and it's going to rotate in such a way that is going to always follow our mouse position. Let's jump right into it. Okay, so we are on our template and we have the server running. We have a dedicated page where we are going to put these new components that we are going to develop today. And the first one is going to be the reordable list. So basically, we are going to build this component that we can use to reorder by drag and dropping any element we want. To do that, we are going to use the view use sortable. So if you go to the view use documentation and just search for use sortable, you find this composable right here. And this is what we are going to use to achieve these components. And in fact, it's going to be straightforward to develop this thing. We are just going to wrap the functionality from view use. And we are also going to use a handle on the left. And in this way, we can keep the on-click events available inside the elements. So to do that, the first thing we need to do is just create a new component called Reordable. So in Nuxt, you can actually have generic components. In this way, we are going to basically disconnect the actual data type from the reordable list, which is very cool. Give it this generic and a generic type called T. We need to import the use sortable composable, which is this one. And you need to actually install the add-ons, which is sortable.js. I already installed this. So we are going to pass the items as a prop. You can see here these items are of type generic T. In this way, the component is going to automatically infer our type, have a reference to our container. So we can just do const, and we are going to create this container element later. And then we can simply use directly the use sortable from view use, passing it the root element to the use sortable, then the items we want to sort, and then some options, the class of the handle. In this way, use sortable is just going to enable drag and dropping only from the handle, so only from the element that has this class. And so we are going to have the root div like this. Then we are going to have a number of divs equal to the number of items, v4 using both the item and the index. And we are using the index as the key, a flex row, because we are going to place inside the handle and then the custom slot. Put this handle right here, binding the class handle that we passed down here, you can see. Then we are just giving some custom opacity, and on hover we are increasing the opacity. Finally, we can have inside this row right here the actual slot of our item, and we are passing both the item and the index. We can hit save. With this very simple component, we already have our drag and drop functionality. And you can see that we completely abstract from both the type of the data that we pass in as well as the slot that we want to render, and this is very powerful. So if we go back to this components page that I just created, we have this new ucard for our reordable elements, and we already have down here a list of text elements. Add a button to add a new item and then render them as a simple code block. So we run the server again. We see that we have a button to add the new elements and we have a list of all of our elements. Now we are going to render here our reordable list. Use our reordable component, pass our items, which is going to be items. And then inside we have our custom slot. So item and index. So for this example, I'm just going to render a text box. So each one of these is going to be an input field that we can change. So we can also see that it's going to change the underlying array. We are going to have some flex row. We have our input, and you can see here we are passing our initial model value to item, and then when we update the model value, we are going to simply update the element inside the items. And you can see here that I am not using the vmodel directive. In fact, if you remove this and just use the vmodel on the item, we are not getting any error here, but as soon as I hit save, we are going to get a lot of errors in the console, and our server actually crashes, because it says that vmodel cannot be used on v4 or vslot scopes. And this is because these variables are not writable, and so we cannot bind them using vmodel. To solve this, we can just, as I showed you before, first we are binding the initial value to the item, and then we are saying that every time we update the model value, we can just simply change the underlying item inside the array. So we are just using the splice, and in this way, if we hit save and go back to our component here, we can see that we have our list of elements that we can change, write something. We can see that the underlying array actually updates. We can actually drag and drop elements. You can see here the array is changing. So if I just drag this 4 up, you can see that as soon as I drop, it's going to update the underlying array. And also if we add a new element, we have this new element that we can always drag and drop. So this is very cool. We also have animation, and this solution is like extremely simple because we were able to achieve this with just this super simple wrapping component, and it's much better than having, for example, up and down arrow to move elements, which are very annoying. So one more functionality I want to add is actually to be able to remove elements. So here, if we go to our component, we can add here a new U button. Whenever we click it, is going to remove the item at the index that we are passing here. So if we go to this function, the only thing it's doing is just splicing the items. Back here, we now have this new button right here, and we can actually remove elements. And we can see that down here, everything updates. So if we add the new elements, everything works. We can drag and drop elements up and down. And so we can see that the underlying array updates correctly. I want to show that we can not only render, for example, a list. If we go to the Reordable component, you are seeing here that we are using a flex and a flex column, but actually we could also change this inside our CSS, our component. So if we go here, we have this Reordable. We could actually add a new class. We want to display a grid. We give it the important sign of CSS. In this way, it's going to override the underlying class inside of the Reordable component. 3 columns. Go back here, and you can see that now the elements are displayed as a grid. Keep in mind that the elements are considered an array. So for example, if I take this element, I want to swap with this element 2, I'm going to go up, but actually you see that the element 2 is going to go on the right and is not going to flip vertically because the elements are basically being rendered as a grid, but they are actually an array. Just something that you need to keep in mind. You can just move them around like this. Also, very cool thing, if we go back to our column here, we add a new element, the element spawns in, and the layout shifts instantly. And to fix this, we can use the animated height component that we developed in the last micro interaction video. You can go check it out. The only thing we need to do is just wrap our Reordable component, our animated height, give this Reordable a full width. If we add a new component, you can see that the layouts shift very smoothly with our animation, and this is extremely cool. Like with this very simple component that we developed, you can just basically wrap whatever component you want, and the layout adjusts with animation. And you can see also the card down here adjusts with the animation, and this is like very simple addition that makes the UI feel much more premium. So the next component we are going to create is a button with a very simple micro interaction. Create a new component called AnimatedArrow. Inside this component, what we want to do is just have basically a component, let's say, that wraps both a text and an arrow, and whenever we hover this component or any parent of it, it's going to animate the arrow in a smooth way. So let me just copy and paste this HTML right here, rendering a row. We are passing also the group class. In this way, whenever we hover any of this element, is going to broadcast down the hover event. And then we have our slot that we can pass whatever we want in it. And then we have our wrapper for the animated icon. It's going to be divided into 2 parts. One is going to be the line, and one is going to be the head. So for the head, we are just using this icon from Nuxt icon, and the line is going to be a very simple line that animates on the scale on the X. Then we are going to define the props, the sides of this icon. In this way, if we are embedding this inside a button, we can also pass the sides down to this element, and so the icon is going to adjust to reflect the sides of the button. And you can see here a very cool trick that instead of our coding this type right here, we can just take this from the button props from Nuxt UI. In this way, everything is synchronized and we do not have to hardcode this type right here. Then we are going to have this very simple computed property that is going to return the sides based on the actual sides that we passed on the props. This is the only code that we need. We need to actually code and add our CSS. Always remember to add the reference to our Tailwind CSS. Then we are going to have these three variables for our component. Our icon size is going to be binded to this size computed property right here. So it's going to be in pixels. So we have the length, which is just going to be computed as the half of the icon size, but you can change this however you want. If you want it to be longer, you can just remove this and the line is going to be longer. Then we are going to have our icon wrapper. It's going to be relative because these two inside are going to be absolutely positioned, and we are going to give it the height and the width. And then we have our arrow line. In this case, you see that we have the width as the length that we specified here. So in this case, if the size, for example, is 20 pixels, the length is 10 pixels, and the width is going to be 10 pixels, which is correct. And we are going to absolutely position this line exactly at the center from the top. And we are also going to align on the left. We are going to give this origin left, which is very important. In this way, when we scale on the X, it's going to scale from the left. Then we are initializing with the scale X 0. Give it the current background. In this way, we can change the background from outside. And then whenever we are group hovering, we are scaling 100% on the X. Okay, we can hit save. And now we just need the CSS for the arrowhead, this thing right here. Again, we are absolutely positioning this thing on the center, and we are giving some text current to the icon, so we can actually again change it from outside. And then whenever we are group hovering, we are moving this icon from the left exactly the length width -1. This -1 is just so that basically the line overlaps a little bit the icon and we do not have any gap. And then we have the height and the width as the icon size. So we should have everything. We can just hit save, add the new ucard for our new component here. So let me just copy and paste this so we can go back to our components. And you can see here that we have this button with this icon on the right. And if we overhit, we can see that we have this very cool animation on the arrow, and we can also style this button as we want. So if we scale down the button, everything is going to adjust dynamically. You can see also the icon and the line. So everything is working. We can also style this using a Nuxt UI, and everything is going to adjust accordingly, which is extremely cool because in fact we are rendering the animated arrow inside the button as a slot. Now the third component we are going to develop is a sticky element. So basically a component that you can use to wrap any element and it's going to make it sticky, meaning that it's going to follow your cursor a little bit to add a very cool micro interaction. To do that, we are going to create a new component again called StickyElement that we can just add right away our new card for this component. Let me just copy and paste this here. So the first thing we want to do is just import everything. So we want to import all of this stuff from Motion because this component is going to be created using Motion. You can go check out the video where we install Motion inside our project. Our whole HTML is just going to be this thing right here. So it's just going to be a motion div. Then we are passing the style, these two variables that we are going to create. And there we are going to have two callbacks. One is hover start and one hover end. So we are going to have some props, which is going to be the amplitude and some spring option that we can use to customize a little bit the stickiness and the behavior of the element. Then we are going to have this template ref. Then we are going to use the uSpring composable from Motion to actually have our two values animated using spring options. So create these X and Y values using the uSpring from Motion V. We are just passing an initial value of 0 and then the spring options from our props. And these X and Y are going to effectively be the offsets on the X and the Y of our elements. Then we can have a very simple boolean to indicate whether we are dragging or not. We are going to have these two functions right here. Whenever we are hovering, we set just the dragging to true. And whenever we are leaving, we just set the value to false and then set the X and Y offsets to 0. In this way, the element is just going to jump to its resting position. Then we are going to hook on the mounted and unmounted event to this function right here, which is going to be exactly this one. So inside this function, we are going to develop all the logic. So here we are just seeing if we are not dragging just return, then we are getting the element. And whenever we are using a ref from motion, you can see here, this element is a motion div. To access the actual element, we need to use this $element property. Then we are getting the bounding rect, and then we are using this frame.read coming from motion. And inside this callback, we are just computing the target x and y, which is just a vector from the center of the element towards the mouse x and y. And then what we want to do is just clamp these values up to a certain value, and then set the x and y. And we can see that this function is not implemented. I already implemented one, but I want to actually compute it together. We can just jump on a plotting tool on the web like GeoGebra to geogebra.org and just launch the calculator. And now here we can plot our functions. So the logic is that whenever we are hovering on the element and we move the mouse, we want the element to actually follow the mouse up to a certain point, but we do not want to clamp the value hardly, because otherwise the sticky element is just going to follow the mouse up to a certain boundary and then just jump back into the resting position, which is fairly ugly. Whenever we are hovering an element, the further away we go with the mouse, the less we want the element to actually follow the mouse cursor. To do that, we can use a very cool mathematical function. I think you already understand what we are going to use, and we can use the log of x. So whenever we are moving our cursor, our value is going to get remapped to a smaller value. Of course, we need to adjust this a little bit. We do not want to have a negative infinite value whenever we go to 0, otherwise everything is going to break. So we can just put a +1 here. Our value can, like x or y value, can either be positive or negative, because consider this is the resting position. I can move my mouse either on the left or on the right. So we want to have this function symmetrical. To do that, of course, using mathematics, we can just make this x a power of 2. And now we have this function which is very smooth and is symmetrical. This function is a little bit too harsh. You can just divide this by 1000. I know it seems pretty weird, but this is exactly what we need. So one thing that we also want to do, you can see on the code that we have this amplitude right here passed as the prop, and this is going to effectively multiply our function to increase the x and y amount we want the element to move. So to do that, we can just create a new variable, add this as a multiplier, and you can see here that whenever we change this, is going to increase the amount that our element is going to travel. So now that we have this function, we can just take this, translate it to code, and so we can just return the props.amplitude log val to the power of 2 plus 1. Now we can hit save, but we are missing one thing. So right here, we use the power of 2 to have this function symmetrical. But actually, whenever we are moving on the negative x, for example, we want, of course, the value to be negative. And to do that, we can just multiply by the sign of the val, taking this function and basically flipping over on the x. In this case, we are just using a sticky element and wrapping a very simple div. And now we have this component right here. Whenever we hover the element is going to follow our mouse cursor a little bit, but as soon as we exit, it's going to jump back to its resting position. And we can customize this behavior by just changing the amplitude. So for example, if we go to our sticky element and increase our amplitude 20, we can see that the element moves much more. We can also wrap, let's comment this. We can wrap, for example, a U button, go back here, and now we have this button, which is basically following our mouse cursor. So you can have like call to actions in your landing page with this thing, which is extremely cool. The last element with micro interaction that we are going to develop is going to be a very cool gradient that you can use for, I don't know, landing pages. I'm just going to develop this so you understand how to use motion to develop cool stuff. Create a new component called MorphingGradient, add the ucard to our components page. So we are going to have just this HTML right here. We import motion, so we can actually use this motion div right here, get our blob element. Finally, we are going to have some properties, specifically the size in pixels. We are going to hook into the mounted and unmounted event, morph function that we are going to use to morph the element. And then whenever we move the mouse, we are going to hook and call this callback mouse move. These three refs that we are going to use to smoothly compute the angle that we need the gradient to rotate towards. So this function mouseMove, whenever we move the mouse, we are going to compute the vector that points towards the rotation, and then we are smoothing our angle using this getSmoothAngle function, and is exactly this one. So whenever we cross the pi and negative pi boundaries, normally the angle gets a swap sign. In this way, the gradient will just rotate on the other side to achieve that rotation. Instead, this function is just using the previous angle and a total rotation value to actually compute smooth values, computing the cases in which we are on the pi or negative pi. And for now, we can have this function empty. To be able to see whether the rotation logic is working, we can just add some CSS. We are giving it some width and height. Background color, in this case, I'm just going to have a gradient, just hit save. And we can see that we have this square right here. And if we move the mouse, it's going to smoothly follow the mouse with certain animation. So we can just go down, and you can see that if I keep turning around, it's not going to jump the other way around, but it's just going to smoothly follow our mouse cursor. So now we are ready to actually implement the morphing logic, add some transitions property here to the blob. We are going to use this animation timing function, and we are going to add these three properties. So we are going to have the transform origin on the center, and we are initializing the filter and then a border radius. So if we go here, you can see that already it animates the border radius. And now we have this kind of square blob that is following the mouse. We just need to implement this morph function, set these three properties. So we are going to set the scale to a random scale, a border radius to a random border radius, and then our filter to a fixed blur that we passed to our props. Now we need to develop these two functions, but before doing that, just let us schedule the next morph function, some random time, and then morph again. So the random scale is just going to be this one. Of course, you can change this and you can have your own custom logic. And what I'm doing is just using this remap function, which is a utility function that I added to the math utilities, which is going to take a number from a certain domain and remap it uniformly to a new domain. In this case, I'm just taking, you see, a random value from 0 to 1 and remapping to 1 minus magnitude and 1 plus magnitude. And I'm doing that for all the three scales. Now we can implement this random border radius, which is going to be basically the same. And in fact, this is the function. We are doing the same logic, just using, some CSS notation, for example, percentage here, and remapping to a certain values. Go back to our page, and now we can see that our gradient gets blurred, and it also changes the border radius and the scale, and it's going to have this very cool morphing effect right here. You can see this is extremely cool. And if we move the mouse, it's going to follow our mouse. You have the code implemented inside the template, so you can just take this code and modify as you want and use this logic for whatever you want. This is it for today's video about micro interactions and subtle animation part 2. You can also check the code directly if you want to edit, or just clone the template and use it. And if you have in mind very specific components, behavior, micro interactions, be sure to leave a comment so I can read them and maybe create a new video in which I develop your suggestion. Cheers!